Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey,
Hey,
Good evening. Today we are reading the first book in our series on the impossibility of a new home with Yuri Herrera's Signs Preceding the End of the World. If you'd like to join our discussion, you can find our book club on Reddit by clicking on the link in our episode description. And you can support us by using our bookshop.org link, which is in our episode description as well. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will have an in depth discussion of this book. We hope you'll join us for that one as well. So, we came up with this series because I wanted to read Buddha in the Attic by Julie Otsuka, and I think we will be reading that in a couple of weeks. And we also had this book, Signs Preceding the End of the World, which was recommended to us by a Redditor on our subreddit. So we kind of built this series around these two books, and it's a book about immigration, about belonging, or the inability to belong in a place. It's something that I, as a child of immigrants, have always been interested in, something that I've thought a lot about. So that's why we're doing this series. That's why this series appeals to me. Is there anything you guys want to talk about with the impossibility of a new home?
what I wanted to play with in the title is that it's appealing, but also very difficult at the same time. It's a very appealing challenge. And sometimes when you arrive in the new place, you do feel like it's not really possible to make that new place your home. So I wanted to find a novel that would investigate the difficulty that newcomers have when they have in this new place.
And I think it also speaks to us on a personal level because we, all three of us, have lived abroad and have felt like we did not belong. So let's talk about this book specifically, which is very much about immigration or migration. Sam, it was your pick. Do you want to talk about Signs Preceding the End of the World?
yeah, this is Yuri Herrera's first novel to be published in English. It was first published in Spanish in 2009 and translated into English in 2015 by Lisa Dillman. It's won a few awards, and though it looks like he's only had a handful of things translated so far, I think this is proof that we're going to be seeing a lot more of his work in coming years. He teaches at Tulane down in New Orleans. So I came across this book while looking into contemporary Latin American novels, since I've loved a lot of the things I've read from that region, but all of the things I've read are older, like from the 70s and 80s. And then one of our listeners, as James mentioned, recommended this book a while back, and I've been wanting to put it into a series since then. So this seemed like a good fit.
It's also very topical. Not only is it well written, but the subject matter is very topical and it's something that people are still trying to figure out. I don't think there's a solution or anything, but it's something that is very much in the forefront of our political news and something that people discuss all the time.
So this novel follows Machina, a tough and wary switchboard operator in a small village in Mexico, although I don't think Mexico is ever named. Most of the places are never really identifiable fully. But she leaves home to cross the border into the US to find her brother, who previously crossed to find land that had supposedly been promised to their family. She gets help along the way from mobsters, their henchmen, and strangers that she meets. And despite the short novella length, it's an epic journey that feels like someone plunging into the depths of hell to find a loved one. I loved this book. I won't say it's perfect. There are some issues and problems, but it's really excellent. It's well written, and the translator did an amazing job. Definitely read the translator's note at the end after finishing, as it helps explain a couple of the quirks of the text and gives really good insight into the role of a translator and the task that they face. The translator, Lisa Dillman, as I mentioned, She did a fantastic job, and she's translated his other English books as well. So I'm looking forward to reading those eventually. I think there's a playfulness of the language that goes toward the way translation works within an individual. I think we'll probably get into that either this episode or the next, and helps describe this kind of crossing between two worlds or languages and not wholly belonging to either, which really fits in with the theme, I think.
Sam, you said you loved this book, but you didn't tell us why you loved this book.
That's true. Well, the playfulness is really interesting to me, and I love this journey that feels very much like you can place it as someone going from Mexico to the US. But as I mentioned, there are no place names per se. All the names we're given are these mythical sounding names, which helps it feel like this journey into the underworld. There are things that feel very real, but also things that feel of mythic proportion. And even though it's really short, it clocks in at just over 100 pages, there is a depth to it. You can read it in one sitting very easily, and the whole thing just felt really engrossing.
Yeah, I think as James mentioned, this is something that has been talked about and talked about almost to death. And I think Herrera knows that his reader is familiar with this topic, but he wants to distance us from what he thinks we know or what we think we know about migration and to approach it from a different angle. And I think he does effectively distance himself from that existing knowledge by using the neologisms that you talk about, by referring to things non-specifically, and by making myths or attaching his story to existing myths. The neologism in the novel that you had praised Lisa Dillman for, I don't know if it works for me as well as it works for you. The narrator is not Machina, so the narrator is not this streetwise character, but I felt like the narration was often at odds with her, only because she is supposed to be so streetwise, but the neologisms seem kind of corny, I guess. And I don't want to criticize the novel too much. So when I say corny, I don't mean it as a huge criticism, but it just didn't feel authentic. It didn't seem like this was a coherent person speaking, and this type of language was coherent with the rest of the way a person would speak. It's very much like that meme that you see on the internet of, how do you do, fellow children? It's like it's put on a little bit. And I don't mind it, but it stands out. And because, Makina is so cool and tough, it's not her. And it doesn't need to be her, but it needs to be somebody.
Are you talking specifically about verse?
Versed is part of it, but there's also shucked, I think, and swished and things like that. Like there are specific words that Herrera uses in Spanish and then Dillman puts them into English, and they don't work for me. They stand out.
So even with the translator's note, even with that understanding,
I mean, we can talk more about the note. The note can be a separate thing. Like, I understand that she's trying to convey something that existed in the original in the translation, but for me, the effect matters more than the effort. I commend her for the effort. I don't doubt that she's trying to do her job well, but it doesn't feel coherent. And I guess the issue for me is that it doesn't feel coherent, but this is writing, and writing isn't speech. So if you think of a narrator as a person speaking, it's a problem. But if you don't think of it as a person speaking, it might not be a problem.
I will say that I don't think that is a problem with the translation. If anyone is to blame for this, it's Herrera himself, because these are his creation. These neologisms are his choices. Like the verse in the Spanish was Harchar, which I either was his creation or is at least very, very new. And even though we do get an explanation about its use and how it works in this book, that's a Herrera thing. I get your discomfort with it, but I felt completely the opposite, that it felt weird. And after the, I don't know, fourth or fifth time, I noted it to look it up later in Spanish, and then didn't have to because at the end of the book it's explained. But it's understood by context, first of all, and then it goes along with the discomfort of moving between worlds and moving between languages. I can understand your qualm, but it really worked for me.
I suppose just to offer a contrast here, I think the best contrast would be Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, which does something very similar with the Russian words in that novel. But I think it works much better in that novel only because it seems more coherent. It seems to be a much larger part of the storytelling than it is here. In this novel, it just seems like an affectation. It seems like something super added, and I don't know why it's there.
I also did not have an issue with it like you, Sam, in that I thought it belonged. The last point you made was that this is a book about moving from one world to the next. And so I could see this play with language as something also indicating an in between state. It's not language that we are totally familiar with, it's something that makes us feel like something is off. But I am not a fan of her choices. The like shucked, for example, I thought was really dumb. I didn't like verse. I actually did not like the translator note because I feel like, I mean, I know she worked hard at translating, but doesn't like every good translator do this? Like, I don't actually need her to explain to me all the thought process and the difficult. It feels like an Oscar speech, like someone who's won an award and it's like, "Oh man, like thank you all for doing all this." Like I don't need to know any of that actually.
Oh, I didn't feel that way at all. Interesting.
Yeah, that's how I felt. But I didn't have an issue with her or Herrera using the neologism. I think that's fine. I just didn't like the word themselves. So I guess in that regard, I might place the blame at the feet of the translator. But at the same time, it wasn't a big deal for me. Like when I finished reading the book, I didn't really care that much about the words. And when I finished reading the translator note, I was like, could have done without that. The translator note, that is. So yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of ambivalent. Like I thought there was a reason for it. Yeah, I thought she could have made better choices, but it was fine. So I'm in between here. I wouldn't really like heavily criticize Dillman for what she did. I just thought it was okay.
Don't most things you read that have been translated, don't most of them have translator's notes?
Yeah, and I want to write a strongly worded letter to like the Guild of Translators and tell them stop doing that because yeah, the author gets all the glory, but I don't give a shit. Like write it on your blog or something. Like I don't want to read it in a book actually because I don't care. Like I don't want to read about how difficult it was to translate this and all this other stuff.
Oh, see, I read that as totally differently. I didn't read this translator's note that way, and I don't read most translators' notes that way. To me, it's like seeing how the sausage is made, not how difficult it was, but what choices they made for certain things, if there are special insights, kind of like reading the notes in that book we just read, Pale Fire, kind of like reading those notes.
But why? I mean, every writer does this, right? Like a translator is like a writer. A translator makes decisions like a writer does at the end of a novel. I don't want the writer to tell me, oh, I made these decisions and these choices because I'm awesome or because this was difficult and that's why I came up with this solution. Like,
Yes.
I feel the same way about writing as I do about translating. I think it's the same.
Oh, I understand, but it to me it's a separate thing. It's not just like look at me how interesting this is. To me, it's talking about the study of language and how language works between itself.
I think the difference between the two of you is that you're talking about two different kinds of translators' notes. The translator's note, in my mind, can either be necessary because of some specific quirk of the language in the original, or it can be interesting. But I think in this case, it was perhaps neither. It was just more self-congratulatory, which is what I think James has issue with, is that if she had solved the problem, that's great, but she doesn't need to tell everybody how hard she worked to solve the problem.
Oh, see, I still disagree. One, because I didn't think it was self congratulatory. And two, because those words that we're talking about were made to stand out in the original. Herrera made them stand out and forced them to be an issue. And so to me, it's not so much, wow, this is difficult. Let me tell you about the journey. It's more that here's a history of these words.
So, Sam, if this were not a translated work and it was just, a writer using neologism, would you want that person at the end of the book to explain?
No, but again, I see those as two different things. One is some guy being cutesy, and the other is someone figuring out the quirks of one language and turning it into quirks of another language.
Yeah, I guess I just don't see much of a difference there. For me, it's both of those acts are acts of creation and acts of intelligence.
Sure. I just see them as they're separate, they're different acts.
Yeah, for me, I just assume, if, whether you're a translator or a writer, you're making choices to create a narrative, to tell a story, and you're choosing prose. So, it doesn't matter to me if you are doing this as a writer or if you're doing it as a translator. For me, the process seems the same. Like, if you do it well, then I will appreciate it. If you want to explain it, then I feel like, well, don't explain it to me unless I want to seek it out.
Well, to Dillman's credit, though, what I'll say is that when we read a translation, the translator would assume that the reader doesn't have the original language and therefore doesn't have access to personally experience the choices in diction that the author is making. So it does seem necessary at times to explain what's going on in the original and how that affected translation. In this case, it may be necessary. I'm not sure. I don't have as much of an issue with the note as you seem to, James, but I don't feel as interested in the note as Sam seems to be either.
It's very inside baseball, I guess.
I have something else I want to say about the protagonist, and I think that this is also going to set Sam off because Sam is more PC than I am, and I think Sam is much more righteous politically than I am. But the protagonist, Makina, is very sympathetic to the sensibilities of progressive people in our real world. But I think that as a character, she plays to that progressive sensibility too wholly. She really embodies it too much. And I think that in a few scenes of the novel, it really robs her of depth and it robs the novel of some complexity that it could have otherwise. I won't mention them specifically just to avoid spoilers, but I just want to say that at times her commentary is too specifically the progressive viewpoint. When she leaves her home and goes into this new territory, one scene I can mention pretty innocuously, she sees an American supermarket and she's saying something like, "Oh, look how much there is there, but look how lonely these people are." And that to me is just a little bit broad. In the review in The Guardian, Maya Jagi's review seems correct when she calls it schematic. I think that the criticisms of American society and the liberal viewpoint, I don't disagree with the viewpoint, but it's just very broad. It's like Critique of Contemporary America 101.
I actually don't have much of a problem with that. Yeah, I mean, with what you just said, I agree for the most part. Again, we're not going to mention some of these scenes, but one of them I remember kind of moving through quickly and not thinking too much of it, but still I agree. And then another, I completely agree. It definitely threw me off. And I remember thinking that there was even a scene where it felt like the trope of a hero walking away from an explosion, and it didn't feel earned. It felt very forced. But yeah, there's definitely several scenes like that where even if you agree with the sensibilities, it feels really heavy-handed.
It's tough because you really want to like her. She is a very righteous person. But the interesting question that I'm seldom seeing in fiction is how do we negotiate a world full of people who are righteous in one way, yet very wrong in another way? So when we encounter a character like Makina who's just always so righteous, it's kind of like sugar in food. Like the sense of justice being satisfied is like eating a spoonful of sugar. You like it, but it's not a complex pleasure. It's very simple. It's easy to understand. It's not nuanced or interesting.
You also mentioned earlier that there is a narrator and it is not Machina or Makina. I think that's part of the issue. I think it's one of the things that makes this interesting but also problematic is that the narrator is not the same as Machina, but there's a blending between them. There's a line that blurs often between those two. And I think that, like in these scenes that you're talking about, it does force something on her that maybe it shouldn't. But also, unrelated to the narrator, it does take some complexity away from her.
So, yeah, to clarify, is it the fact that she has these progressive viewpoints that you dislike? Or is it the fact that she is consistently progressive? That, for example, if she were consistently conservative or consistently another ideology without any complexity, that you would feel the same way? Or is it the fact that she holds these progressive viewpoints? That's what's irritating.
It's the consistency that bothers me because it's very easy to hate and it's very easy to cheer for somebody. But the interesting thing is to have somebody that you love in one way and hate in another way at the same time. And I think in a novel that is full of political import like this is, that's really where we should be going with our politics and our art because I think we're realizing is that we have to live together with people who are not completely good or completely bad. And how do we do that? That's what's missing in my mind from this novel.
Right. So it's the fact that when we look at this political debate on immigration, that she kind of represents this one side of the debate wholly. And she does it in a way that doesn't make any sense because she's from Mexico. She's not American. That's what is kind of disorienting for me. There's a scene where she sees gay people getting married and she applauds it. And it doesn't really make sense to me why she would. It doesn't sound like it has anything to do with her. So I wonder, why is it in the book at all? Thematically, it seems to just stick out. And these kinds of choices make her a character that I end up finding kind of unbelievable. So that's my greater critique of her. For me, it's not so much the consistent progressive ideology, it's the fact that because of that, that's one symptom. Because of that, she's someone who I actually cannot believe as a character. She seems larger than life. She seems too perfect. She is really attractive, but also really educated, also really streetwise. She can do almost everything, and she's woke. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me that this person exists, and I don't know why she's so perfect. Like, I don't like that fact about this novel, and I actually really like this novel, so in some ways, this is my only critique of the novel, is that I didn't like the main character, unfortunately. Or I'll rephrase, I didn't dislike her. I keep on saying I don't like her. It's not that I dislike her, it's that I couldn't believe her as a character.
I'm the opposite actually. Like I believe her, but I don't think that she's interesting. I think her being in the novel makes the novel less interesting than it would be with a different character.
I can see that, but for me, it just feels like she's Herrera.
I mean, it makes sense with a Mexican professor of political science. Like she's embodying a certain worldview that I'm guessing is very similar to Herrera's own worldview, which is very common in fiction. I mean, it's not specifically a problem that he has, but it's just not as interesting as it could have been. Sam, I'm waiting for you to come to Herrera's defense. I feel like we've set you up big time for this. Like, you love
You
this
love this
novel.
book.
Yeah, I like this book too. I know I shit on everything, and I'm shitting on this novel, but I like this novel. My problem is that it's such a short novel that everything has to be done well or it just stands out.
The problem is I do agree about these things that you guys are saying. They just weren't as big an issue for me. She is a little too perfect, but we also see her over time get beaten up and destroyed. I saw one essay that used the word obliterated. This book obliterates her. The country obliterates her. The crossing obliterates her. You're calling her perfect. I think that's one word for her, but also it's destroying the idea of a person, turning them into something else. Someone that she doesn't even recognize, someone that she isn't. We're not going to give spoilers here. We'll talk about things like the ending in the next episode, but we're seeing a character or a person get deconstructed and put back together in a different configuration. So it starts out perfect. I agree that she is a little too perfect, and the progressive, to me, it wasn't even the consistency of the progressiveness. It was just that it strikes the exact same bleeding heart note. And this is coming from someone who is a bleeding heart liberal. It's definitely too much. But it's seeing someone fall quite a ways from grace into this underworld. So as far as her character goes, I chalk that up to the myth making that's going on and going through a sort of hero's journey of a sort where she's above ground at one point and then she is forced underground for the whole rest of the novel.
I agree that she gets obliterated. I definitely see that. But at the same time, early on in the novel, I don't even know how far, like maybe it's like 1/4 through, she has to discipline some naughty boys. And later on in the novel, and this is in spoiler territory, so I'll be a little bit careful here. She talks back to an authority figure and tells him off. And to me, it's the same thing. Do you kind of see it as the same thing? Like, I do see that in the process of the journey, she has changed, but at the same time, she's still that person who is indomitable. Like, at the end, I feel like I don't know if I should even say this because it might be a spoiler, but she seems indomitable. She seems like she's the same kind of person.
Yeah, there are hills and valleys that she goes through, I guess.
Yes, literally hills and valleys.
Right. It's not one giant hill that she starts on and then ends up at the bottom. She kind of goes over several different bumps and craters. No, I agree. And the second thing you mentioned that I wish we could go into detail,
Well, we will next week, hopefully.
that really did stick out. That is something that Iad was alluding to earlier. That really did stick out to me more than anything else in the book. That scene felt over the top. Even though you're right, they are very similar actions that she takes throughout. I can see how that would be a problem at the end when supposedly she's obliterated, like I'm saying. But yeah, not only does that show that no, she's exactly the same person, she hasn't really changed, but also I just didn't believe that scene at all. I didn't believe the ending of that scene. I didn't believe her actions in that scene.
I mean, in some ways, it's understandable because if you read this book as a myth of sorts, then you don't have to believe it.
Right.
And that's actually, even though I'm being kind of maybe overly critical here, I actually did really like this book because that's what I enjoyed about it is that it kind of straddles the line between reality and the mythic or the epic. That's really interesting. So we'll take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll talk about who we would recommend this book to. We'll be right back. Okay, we are back. So, who would you recommend this book to?
I would recommend this book to people like Sam. If you have a Sam in your life, definitely give them this book. As I was saying earlier, this book satisfies that sense of justice. And if you have a sort of no justice, no peace sort of person in your life, this is the kind of book that they'll want to read because you do care about Makina, you do root for her, and it's satisfying to see her win. So that type of reader will enjoy this book.
Yeah, I guess I agree. I think if you gave this to someone on the other side of that, there's a good chance they would just end up rolling their eyes at the things that we've mentioned having problems with. I think this would be an interesting book to teach to high school kids.
No, that was my question.
Oh,
My question was going to be, do you think they should teach this book to high school kids?
yeah, because not only is it topical,
Thanks, Sam.
but you're welcome. Well, hey, you should have written it down so I didn't step on your toes. Not only is it topical, but the myth making that is happening here goes along really well with other things that you read that I read in sophomore year, I believe. But I think probably any age in high school would work. I think you could fit this into a lot of different kinds of curricula.
Also, it's short.
Also, it's very short, yes.
Yeah, I would probably recommend this to most people. I think its length actually is very interesting. I think people who read this book would be surprised. And it's nice to have a book that'll surprise people. Like, I wouldn't give it to racists, um, but I would give it to almost anyone else, even people on the other side of the political spectrum. Is there something in this book, like if you are someone who's leaning Republican, but you're not, like burning crosses, do you think they would be so offended by this book that they wouldn't read it?
No, I just, like I said, I think there would be a good amount of eye rolling, but maybe not. Maybe I'm not giving enough credit to readers of other beliefs.
As I said earlier, I think Herrera is going out of his way to distance the novel from what we already believe about this issue. And I don't know for sure if that distancing will work on people who have these very strong conservative views on the issue. But if they are receptive to having a conversation disconnected from what they already think, then it probably would work.
So, in our review of The Intuitionist by Whitehead, which we released probably over a month ago now, yeah, you talked about how Whitehead kind of gives us a different way of looking at race, of looking at black white relations. Do you think Herrera does anything like that in this book on this issue?
I'm not sure if he does. I think that the distancing effect that I think he's trying to accomplish is not meant to change perspective so much as just a way to present emotional content in a way that would allow people to experience it more directly without the intellectual content of this debate getting in the way. I think it's a very emotionally resonant book, and I think for that resonance to occur, you have to be distant.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I don't see anything new here in terms of addressing or reframing this debate. I think it does do a good job of pulling the reader in and presenting this issue in a way that is affecting. That is a real strength here.
Yeah.
It approaches the concept in a different way rather than trying to change the conversation.
And another way he makes it accessible is he frames it as a quest, and it's something that we get all the time in popular culture. So, because this is a quest narrative, it's something that is very accessible, and another reason why I would, recommend it to everyone. I don't think you have to think too hard when you read this book. I think you just enjoy it, and at the end of it, you have some feelings about what's going on, and that's about it. Well, since I got the last word in, let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base here with our review of Signs Preceding the End of the World, you can let us know on Reddit. That link, once again, is in the episode description. You can find us on social media at Canonical Pod. If you want to help us out, you can leave us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. When you leave a review, you can also let us know if there's a book you'd like us to add. We'll be back next week with a more in depth discussion of this book, Signs Preceding the End of the World. You can go ahead and find a copy of that book and join us then. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.